Good morning, everybody. This is Yin Yang in California with Morsels of a Thought number 1101. This is the last ASCII code we've got. It's not really ASCII, but 1101 until we come to the 17th of January, which will be not just a palindrome, but a strobogrammatic number. 1111 will be the same when you turn it upside down as right side up, and backward and forward it'll be the same too. Interesting. That's a palindrome, and the turning it upside down part is the strobogram. Today it is Sunday, the 7th of January 2024. I am reading a Sunday series for you. It started out on Saturdays, and today's the first Sunday we're doing it, called Our Town. It is a play by Thornton Wilder, and it's about a little town in the, I want to say Midwest, but it's not. It's not the Midwest. It's New England. Anyway, oh no, I did that again. Oh, good morning, John Clark. Hi, how are you? I forgot to turn down that notification, so I'm sorry. It's going to go off a few times. I hope not, but maybe. Okay, so we've just been walking along. Mr. Webb, the kids have gotten off school. The kids, good morning, John Clark. I see you there. And the kids have gotten off school, and Emily has been putting on airs and pretending that she's this lady. And she says, Papa, you're terrible. One minute you tell me to stand up straight, and the next minute you call me names. I just don't listen to you. She gives him an abrupt kiss. Mr. Webb says, golly, I never got a kiss from such a great lady before. He goes out of sight. Emily leans over and picks some flowers by the gate of her house. By the way, this is a play in case you haven't picked up on it. So we do quotation marks instead of italics when we write them down. The title of a play, I mean. George Gibbs comes careening down Main Street. He is throwing a ball up to dizzying heights and is waiting to catch it again. This sometimes requires his taking 6 steps backward. He bumps into an old lady, invisible to us. George says, Excuse me, Mrs. Forrest. Stage manager, as Mrs. Forrest. Go out and play in the fields, young man. You've got no business playing baseball on Main Street. George says, Awfully sorry, Mrs. Forrest. Hello, Emily. Emily says, Hello. George says, You made a fine speech in class. Emily says, Well, I was really ready to make a speech about the Monroe Doctrine, but at the last minute, Miss Corcoran made me talk about the Louisiana Purchase instead. I worked an awful long time on both of them. Page. Oops, I just lost my bookmark here. George says, Gee, it's funny, Emily. From my window up there, I can just see your head nights when you're doing your homework over in your room. Emily, why can you? George says, You certainly do stick to it, Emily. I don't see how you can sit still that long. I guess you like school. Emily says, Well, I always feel it's something you have to go through. George says, Yeah. Emily, I don't mind it, really. It passes the time. George says, Yeah. Emily, what do you think? We might work out a kind of telegraph from your window to mine. And once in a while, you could give me a kind of hint or two about one of those algebra problems. I don't mean the answers, Emily, of course not. Just some little hint. Emily says, Oh, I think hints are allowed. So if you get stuck, George, you whistle to me and I'll give you some hints. George says, Emily, you're just naturally bright, I guess. Emily, I figure that's just the way a person's born. George, yeah, but you see, I want to be a farmer, and my Uncle Luke says whenever I'm ready, I can come over and work on his farm, and if I'm any good, I can just gradually have it. Emily, you mean the house and everything? Enter Mrs. Webb with a large bowl and sits on the bench by her trellis. George says, Oh, for anybody who doesn't know what a trellis is, it's one of those wooden grids that plants and ivy can grow on. The first time I ever had to look it up was when I went to a restaurant called The Trellis in Washington, D.C. It was a great place, too, but I had no idea what the hell a trellis was until I got home. Uh, George says, "Yeah, well, thanks. I'd better be getting out to the baseball field. Thanks for the talk, Emily. Good afternoon, Mrs. Webb." Mrs. Webb, "Good afternoon, George." "So long, Emily," George says. Emily says, "So long, George." Mrs. Webb, "Emily, come and help me string these beans. String these beans for the winter. George Gibbs let himself have a real conversation, did he? Why, he's growing up. How old would George be?" Emily, "I don't know." Mrs. Webb, "Let's see. He must be almost 16. Emily, "Mama, I made a speech in class today and I was very good." Mrs. Webb, "You must recite it to your father at supper. What was it about?" Emily, "The Louisiana Purchase. It was like silk off a spool. I'm going to make speeches all my life. Mama, are these big enough?" Excuse me. Mrs. Webb, "Try and get them a little bigger if you can." Emily, "Mama, will you answer me a question? Serious?" Mrs. Webb, "Seriously, dear, not serious." Emily, "Seriously, will you?" Mrs. Webb, "Of course I will." Emily, "Mama, am I good looking?" Mrs. Webb, "Yes, of course you are. All my children have got good features. I'd be ashamed if they hadn't." Emily, "Oh, Mama, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, am I pretty?" Mrs. Webb, "I've already told you yes. Now that's enough of that. You have a nice young pretty face. I never heard of such foolishness." Emily, "Oh, Mama, you never tell us the truth about anything." Mrs. Webb, "I am telling you the truth." Emily, "Mama, were you pretty?" Mrs. Webb, "Yes, I was, if I do say it. I was the prettiest girl in town next to Mamie Cartwright." Emily, "But Mama, you've got to say something about me. You've got to say something about me. Am I pretty enough to get anybody, to get people interested in me?" Mrs. Webb, "Emily, you make me tired. Now stop it. You're pretty enough for all normal purposes. You come along now and bring that bowl with you." Emily, "Oh, Mama, you're no help at all." Stage manager, thank you. That'll do. We'll have to interrupt again here. "Thank you, Mrs. Webb. Thank you, Emily." Mrs. Webb and Emily withdraw. "There are some more things we want to explore about this town." He comes to the center of the stage. During the following speech, the lights gradually dim to darkness, leaving only a spot on him. "I think this is a good time to tell you that the Cartwright interests have just begun building a new bank in Grover's Corners. Had to go to Vermont for the marbles, sorry to say, and they've asked a friend of mine what they should put in the cornerstone for people to dig up 1,000 years from now. Of course, they've put in a copy of the New York Times and a copy of Mr. Webb's Sentinel. We're kind of interested in this because some scientific fellas have found a way of painting all that reading matter with a silicate glue that'll make it keep 1,000, 2,000 years. We're putting in a Bible and the Constitution of the United States and a copy of William Shakespeare's plays. What do you say, folks? What do you think? You know, Babylon once had 2 million people in it, and all we know about them is the names of the kings and some copies of wheat contracts and contracts for the sale of slaves. Yet every night all those families sat down to supper, and the father came home from work, and the smoke went up the chimney, same as here. And even in Greece and Rome, all we know about the real life of the people is what we can piece together out of the joking poems and comedies they wrote for the theater back then. So I'm going to have a copy of this play put in the cornerstone, and the people 1,000 years from now will know a few simple facts about us, more than the Treaty of Versailles and the Lindbergh flight. See what I mean? So people 1,000 years from now, this is the way we were in the provinces north of New York at the beginning of the 20th century. This is the way we were in our growing up and in our marrying and in our living and in our dying. A choir, partially concealed in the orchestra pit, has begun singing, "Blessed be the tie that binds." So Simon Stimson stands directing them. Two ladders have been pushed onto the stage. They serve as indication of the second story in the Gibbs and Webb houses. George and Emily mount them and apply themselves to their schoolwork. Dr. Gibbs has entered and is seated in his kitchen reading. Well, a good deal of time's gone by. It's evening. That's what the stage manager is saying. You can hear choir practice going on in the congregational church. The children are at home doing their schoolwork. The day is running down like a tired clock. Simon Stimson. Now look here, everybody. Music come into the world to give pleasure. Softer, softer. Get it out of your head that music's only good. Get it out of your heads that music's only good when it's loud. You leave loudness to the Methodists. Good morning, listeners cantata. You leave loudness to the Methodists. You couldn't beat 'em even if you wanted to. Now again, tenors. George. Emily. Emily. Hello. George. Hello. Emily. I can't work at all. The moonlight's so terrible. George. Emily, did you get the third problem? Which? The third. Why, yes, George, that's the easiest of them all. George. I don't see it. Emily, can you give me a hint? Emily, I'll tell you one thing. The answer's in yards. George, in yards? How do you mean? Emily, in square yards. Oh, in square yards. Yes, George, don't you see? Yeah. Emily says, in square yards of wallpaper. George, wallpaper. Oh, I see. Thanks a lot, Emily. Emily says, you're welcome. My, isn't the moonlight terrible? And choir practice going on. I think if you hold your breath, you can hear the train all the way to Contucook. Can you hear it? George, what do you know? Emily, well, I guess I better go back and try to work. George, good night, Emily, and thanks. Emily, good night, George. Simon Stimson. Before I forget it, how many of you will be able to come in Tuesday afternoon and sing at Fred Hersey's wedding? Show your hands. That'll be fine. That'll be right nice. We'll do the same music we did for Jane Trowbridge's last month. And now we'll do Art Thou Weary, Art Thou Languid? It's a question, ladies and gentlemen. Make it talk. Ready? Okay. So here we are. This is Act 1. We're still, Emily and George have been doing their homework, and we are still in Act 1. Let me take a look and see how many acts this entire play has. It's got 3 acts. Okay. Alrighty, you guys. I will see you again tomorrow. Tomorrow's a Monday. Monday, we shall do a Marcus Aurelius Meditations reading. Then it's miscellaneous Monday, so sometimes we'll do Marcus Aurelius, other times we will not. Okay, old Kinderhook. Bye.